So next Saturday, 5 bells. Meet here, 5 o'clock. Everybody, somebody look at me like, what's 5 bells mean? It means 5 o'clock, 1700. For cleaning, shouldn't take long. Hildy's going to walk us right through it. Should go like this if everybody shows up. If me and John Thompson show up, it'll take a long time. So try to, or make arrangements. We got him.
I will be here.
Okay.
I don't know. They might not either. We have a out of town.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll see what shakes loose.
I probably won't be there either.
Okay. Oh, that's right. Your dad told me. But the rest of you, try to show up. And then we'll party afterward. We'll have fun. So, okay. So we're back to the minimal facts of the resurrection. It does very little good. I mean, it's cute to be able to show somebody how God exists because my coffee cup is here full of coffee. Somebody might be impressed by this.
Yeah, that was last week.
And be like, wow, that's really interesting. There is a God. Okay, great, I believe in a God. And I'm going to make him up myself.
Yeah.
Right? We don't want that. We've got to figure out which God is the true God. This might be important if there is a God. Might be worth your time to figure out what this God's like. My considered guess, as gods go, gods are going to demand things or ask something of you. Or, they're not going to be indifferent to your individual collective life. Yes, Isaac.
Like, if he asks you to try to stop people from sinning, then you should probably do that.
You should, exactly right. If the Lord commands you, you shall not steal, Amelia, then you probably ought to think about that, or at least give it some thought. Yes.
What the heck is this?
Oh, I'll catch you up in a second. All right, so if there is a God and we need to figure out who he is, we need to start exploring the world's religions. Well, fortunately for us, we're Lutherans, we don't have to do that. We know who the true God is, and we can back it up with historical fact.
The task force is back.
What's that?
The task force is back.
Oh, yeah. Okay? And as we've been through this last year, but this is for the new people and also review for us. It never hurts to review this. We've got the minimal facts, and we're looking at this fact here in particular. Jesus crucified by Romans. All right? No credible scholar, historian, anybody who studies this will deny this. So again, if you get to a point in your life where stuff is just so bad and you're thinking, how could God be real? This might be an okay place to start once you kind of get to a point where you can think that way. Because some bad things are going to happen to you in life. It's guaranteed. Christ said, in this life you will have condos and houses on the beach. No. He said, in this life you will have trouble. Okay, so this is stuff to think about and just start simply. Okay, Jesus existed. There is a God. That one guy a long time ago when I was in Sunday school taught me that God existed because he had a coffee cup with coffee in it. Okay, start simply. Right? Friend challenges your faith, these sorts of things. Will be helpful to you. That's the idea. Okay, so what we looked at last week was several sources external. Do we not have enough of these to go around now?
Nope.
Bummer. Okay, if a couple of you guys could share, that would make me happy.
Here you go.
So at least the girls over here can have a copy out. No
See,
problem.
that's the problem though. You won't even look at this one.
So we talked about Tacitus, which is probably one of the better sources in my opinion. Lucian, which again, I was very impressed by the reading Mr. Pullman did for us last week on that, where he actually uses the accounts of Christianity in fiction, which is pretty fascinating. Take there. And we got the Josephus. Now, Josephus it does account for Christ, to be sure. But if you look at Josephus, what number is he? Just lost my place. 3? Okay, go down to number 3, Josephus. Flavius, however you want to pronounce that. Josephus. The first couple of paragraphs, okay, fine. This is from the Antiquities of the Jews. But Josephus allegedly writes this. About this time there would live Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things, and 1,000 other marvels about him, and the tribe of the Christians so called after him has still to this day not disappeared. Okay, that sounds like really, really compelling evidence around, the turn of the century here from Josephus, a Jew, Jewish historian. But it has come to light, due to recent scholarship on these sorts of things, that this has been monkeyed with by Christians and probably, kind of touched up to make it look like it's a little better than it is. Okay. However, a couple of points on this paragraph in particular. Yes.
I just looked at paragraph 4. Pliny the Younger is like he witnessed Pompeii, and I read about it in my history.
Oh, cool.
He witnessed the Pompeii thingy, and wrote about it, and we can still read his readings.
Yeah.
And his Pliny the Older died because he refused to leave.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. That's good. That's good. Good. Thank you. Historical input, but we'll get there, and you definitely add that. So we'll get to Pliny, and that's good. That's very good. Thank you for that. I'm not sure I knew that. Oh yes, Josephus, right? So here's the thing: is Christians, people accepted this paragraph from Josephus right up until probably the height of really German higher critical thought came into being, which so higher criticism. So I don't know if we talked about this before. I think we did a long time ago. So you've got this idea of text. Okay, text criticism, which for any ancient studies of texts, this is something that's cropped up. This is what I had the pleasure of studying at Claremont, actually. Yes, Isaac.
Where's Amelia?
She's teaching her class. She teaches the children. Yeah.
Oh.
So when I was at Dallas Seminary, one of the quote good seminaries, except they're dispensationalists, but we can let that slide because they do some other good work. When I was at Dallas Seminary, we did lower criticism, which basically what we did was we would take old fragments of manuscript and try to figure out which was the original text based on the age, based on the consistency throughout the textual. So if we had, I'm just pulling something out. Say we had 5 copies of John 10, right? We would take those and we try to figure, okay, which one's the oldest, and which version, because believe it or not, as people copied things, they made mistakes. This happened. And what's really surprising is how few mistakes were made. The mistakes are there, but what's surprising is the mistakes comparative to a lot of other ancient Near Eastern literature that's been passed down through the ages, the mistakes are few and far between comparatively. It's pretty interesting. But the point is, so we would look at that, and we would look at what was the most consistent text. So really those two things. We'd look at what was the oldest, that was a big deal, and what was the earliest, and then what was the most consistent. So we called that lower criticism, because we're just trying, and all we're trying to do is get back to what the original author may have written. That was the idea. And if you remember back, a while ago, I said, this is not the Bible. This is a copy of the Bible. Okay, that may sound blasphemous, but again, ask any, all your dads are learned scholars. Ask any of your dads, if this is the Bible, and you say, no, Dad, this is a copy of the Bible, they will agree with you, because it is. Okay, but what did we find out? That we have a copy that's 99% accurate to the original. So might as well be the original, right? Okay, that's the idea. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do in lower criticism. Well, that's good, right? But then I go to Claremont, right? the Claremont School of Theology and learn how to do higher criticism, which involves stuff like this, where we see this passage from Josephus and we go, wait a second, this doesn't pass the smell test, because just doesn't sound like something a first century Jew would say about Christians. We might start there. Or we might say, well, there's a passage in the Bible that really sounds like it's overlaid with Trinitarian concepts that really don't jive with the rest of the text. So we kind of start with those kind of, that's weird. In fact, I remember one class I took, Old Testament class. That was the first thing that the professor said. Pick out a text, and when you stumble across something that's weird, make note of that. Okay. Yeah. Something just doesn't seem to fit. Whatever. So we'd start from there. And then you would kind of take that and run with it. Now, sometimes, like with Josephus here, we really found out, there's some other copies of this text that we can see, it was monkeyed with. We've got some actual hard data. But unfortunately, a lot of higher criticism, this kind of, this doesn't quite pass the smell test, you start running down these rabbit trails, and all kinds of bizarre things start to happen. What are you thinking?
So, I think the problem is the criteria for proof.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's a totally legitimate thing to do.
Sure.
If you are trying to figure out, like you said, what is the actual text of the Bible,
Right.
which we do all the time.
Yeah.
People are doing this right now, right?
Yes.
They're still trying to figure out what exactly the original text was, because it matters. And so, that's legitimate. If you come across a passage and you say, for instance, the last part of Mark,
Right.
and you say, this doesn't sound like Mark.
Yeah.
This is weird.
Yeah.
And then you start looking into it. That's totally fine.
Sure.
Because it doesn't sound like Mark. But the problem is the proof that the higher critics will use that something is not legitimate.
Right.
Will be something like, well, he says a miracle happened, and that can't be true.
Right.
So this part is wrong.
Right.
Or, something like, this too accurately predicts Jesus.
Right.
And since prophecy can't happen,
Right.
this part of the Old Testament was obviously changed later by Christians.
Right.
And
Okay.
so those sorts of assumptions are really the problem. Like,
Yeah.
just to look at Josephus and say, this does not sound like not only a first century Jew, but also it just doesn't sound like Josephus,
Right.
is a more legitimate criticism than to say,
Yeah.
well, since Isaiah predicts Christ too accurately,
Yeah.
it must have been monkeyed by Christians.
Right. Yeah.
Those are a different set of assumptions.
Yeah. Well, and the difference is that the difference is we actually have some data. We actually have some other copies of Josephus to show. He wasn't quite as strong. Now, that's not to say, again, this was the Christian reading for centuries until somebody said, this sounds weird, and they looked into it, and lo and behold, somebody monkeyed with it. Okay, fine. But at the same time, it doesn't not say what's here.
Right.
It doesn't completely contradict it. So Josephus talks in these terms about who Christ was. He really hedges on, this idea of Jesus. This is one thing that compels scholars, across the board. My New Testament professor at Claremont, who was an atheist, compels him to believe that Jesus' followers actually had experiences because of passages like this from Josephus. Okay. Because, it was written about. This is early stuff. So something big was going on here. And I think at the end of the day, if you look at the big picture of things, it's foolish for scholars to sit around and say, this whole Christian thing was just made up nonsense. Well, made up nonsense has affected all of human history, including our calendar. So you can't brush it, you can't wave it aside like that. Just doesn't work, historically. It's not an honest scholarly approach to things. So back to Mr. Pullman's point, and this is for free. So here's what we did in higher criticism. We had, so you take the Gospels, right? And you start monkeying around with this higher criticism thing. And what you find out is the Gospels, there's 3 of them that sound very similar to one another. Right? You guys ever notice this? Have you guys read the Gospels? If you guys been listening for the past however long you've been alive in church, okay, you'll notice that 3 of the Gospels all have similar stories in them or accounts. They call those the Synoptic Gospels. All right, John, totally different, right? You ever notice that? Then you get to John, I mean, he's got a couple of things that the other Gospels have, but not much. So what we do is we look at that as higher textual critics and go, that's really interesting. And we think, okay, I wonder how this all got put together. And we think, all right, well, you look at Mark, and he looks like the most basic of the Gospels, right? Like he was the primitive form of it, perhaps, right? And you think, and it's interesting that Luke and Matthew, do that, differentiate between Mark and Matthew, both borrow from, there's very little in Mark, there's a few things, a couple things in Mark that are not in Matthew and Luke, but very few. Okay, Luke and Mark, you take their accounts, put them together, you're pretty much going to have a copy of Mark. Now, Mark has a few unique things. So what we say is, and there are a few unique things to Luke. There are a few unique things to Matthew. But for the most part, they draw on Mark. So we say, well, Luke and Matthew must have known or been aware of or had a copy of Mark that they were writing their Gospels from. Okay? Now, this is all nonsense, mind you. Okay, I just want to tell you how we thought. Or where these rabbit trails go with scholars. All right? And why it's perfectly okay for you to go, that's ridiculous. Because I was trained to think this way, and it's dumb. I mean, because you're just, it's complete speculation. You're doing this on no evidence whatsoever. Go ahead.
Well, I think it gets back to something we talked about last year, I guess. Right?
Yeah.
With our presuppositionalist arguments, we were talking about the presupposition, the things that you think before you start thinking, right?
Yeah.
The things you assume before you start thinking. And part of the assumption there is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not inspired.
Right.
It's assumed before they start thinking.
Yeah.
They assume that they are written by men exclusively, God had no hand in this, and that we need to explain it in purely human terms. And I mean, if we had 3 books that were written in 1980, and 1985, and 1990, say, and they all sounded as similar as Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'd be pretty sure that the guys that wrote later copied the earlier one, right? This is called plagiarism. It happens, right? But that assumes that they weren't inspired. That assumes that those people weren't actually, another assumption they make is that they're written way later than they are, right? And so they assume that the people who were with Jesus didn't actually write them. They assume that the tax collector, Levi, did not become Matthew and then write the Gospel of Matthew, right? You say that's all made up. Yeah. Before anybody can argue about it, they just assume it. Right. It's all made up. So we have to come up with the other explanations. And that's why it does sort of logically follow if you have these kooky assumptions from the beginning. Yeah. But you have to assume things for which you have no reason to assume. Right. And it's just crazy. Right. That's right. That's exactly right. You're starting from a presupposition that would lead you to, okay, well, if this isn't a supernatural thing, then it's got to be a human thing, and so how can we put this together? The other thing I don't like, and you argue just the way they would, but here's one thing I would argue, just on a purely reasonable level, I would say to them, okay, now wait a second, we have history texts all over the place. So we have history books, say, on the Civil War, and they all sound very similar, and they all have the same stories, etc., etc. They're still history books. Right, and that's another assumption they make, is that those aren't histories. Right. They're made up religious stories. Right. They're the equivalent of Jason and the Golden Fleece. Right. And it's just like random mythology. Right. And then they commit the genetic fallacy. You guys remember the genetic fallacy? Mm-hmm. Okay, which says that because somebody's from the first century, they're stupid. All right, which is dumb. You're just assuming because they're from a primitive culture that they're stupid.
Shows that you're stupid.
Right. Exactly
Right.
right.
Copy of Aristotle and beat them with it.
Right, exactly, right. I mean, tell me Aristotle was stupid. I mean, that's just ridiculous. So the idea that, say, St. Mark or St. Luke, who writes a brilliant history, and it's completely obvious to anyone who reads Mark that he's writing an historical document. Okay, for him to pass it off as some fiction, for him for this thing to circulate and have people buy into it, and the only reason people are buying into it is because they're stupid first century, primitives, is a completely ridiculous argument. That's again what they call the genetic fallacy. So anyway, get back to this. So Luke and Matthew borrow from Mark, but Mark has some stuff in it that's not in Luke and Matthew. Luke has some stuff in it that's not from Mark or Matthew. Matthew has some stuff in it that's not from Mark or Luke. So there must be this secret source that we decided to call Q. There's some secret source that all three are drawing from in order to compose their Gospels. This means, Caleb, what's that mean in German? Quelle? I don't know how to pronounce it.
Right.
I just call it Quelle. Quelle? Quelle? I don't even say it in German. It sounds more French to me, but it means source. I don't know, ask your dad. Anyway, I don't know German very well. But that's what Q comes from. So anyway, but that's where this stuff takes you, right? It's helpful when we're analyzing Josephus. Not so helpful when it kind of goes off the rails in this direction. I mean, and again, my New Testament professor, his doctoral thesis, if you can get this, he argued that Luke was not getting his extra material from Q, he was getting it from Homer.
From Homer?
Yeah. He wrote, yeah, that's what it's talking. And he wrote a couple of other books. I've got them. I can lend them to you if you like. I mean, he would set up these Greek constructions and show how the Greek constructions were similar, and I'm like,
yeah. So he used similar constructions. So if I use similar constructions to Shakespeare, am I right?
Right. Are you copying Shakespeare?
Or maybe he just read Homer a bunch because he was educated.
Yeah. Well, so he and Bar Ehrman were buddies, but they had a falling out over this.
Oh.
Yeah. Ehrman Ehrman used to talk about him, but he won't anymore. His name's Dennis McDonald, but Ehrman has disowned this guy as a crazy person, because he is. I mean, this is ridiculous that Luke is drawing from Homer. Give me a break.
Crazier than the Q document.
Well, I agree, but anyway. So you see where this goes. It was funny, and it would have been funnier if I did it as a joke. But I wrote a paper for him showing how. Okay, so I'm way off the rails now. I got to get back to talking about this. But anyway, one more story, and then we'll get back. I wrote a paper on. So I read the Apocalypse of Peter. Okay, which is there's actually some Gnostic writings we got from they found this collection of writings in the desert, and they called it the Nag Hammadi Library. And they were from Gnostic Christians, and I'm not going to go into all that, but one of the documents was called the Apocalypse of Peter. And it was about what hell's going to be like. It's really disturbing, frightening stuff. Don't read it unless you just really want or interested in that sort of thing. It's like, Dante's Inferno, that sort of thing, that pales in comparison to Apocalypse of Peter. So what I did, in the spirit of finding out parallelisms between, I wrote my paper. I thought it was a pretty well-conceived thing in a sense, because I was trying to track the literary connection between those types of literatures into the modern period. And so I wrote how Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was like the Apocalypse of Peter.
Nice.
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty brilliant idea. He gave me a C on that paper. Yes, Isaac. Huh?
And how you said hoodwinked was like.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh right. Yeah, I was telling Isaac the other day he likes that movie. You guys seen that movie Hoodwinked?
Yes.
Yeah. So you see all these perspectives going on,
Yeah.
and you're like, well, and they all seem like they're conflicting, right? But at the end, you realize that all the different versions of the story all line up, and they're all just different versions of the story from different perspectives. Well, that's sort of how the Gospels are. They all are, if you were able to synthesize them, they would make one coherent story, just like happens in Hoodwinked, right? But sometimes we don't really see that sort of thing. Anyway, yeah, it's pretty interesting. What?
The good guy, the bunny that seems to be the bad guy ends up being the bad guy.
Right. So anyway, yeah. The reason he hated that is because he thought I was mocking his theories, and I totally was, and I was trying to use his theories, but he was like, "Oh, you would have been better off just to do an annotated bibliography on the literature." Whatever. I hate you. Anyway, I was really angry because So anyway, forget about that. So there's Josephus. All right. By the way, hopefully, we'll see if we can get through the rest of these.
We can start with it.
Yeah. Who would like to read Pliny? Nadia, since you're my my Pliny expert, go ahead and read at least one paragraph of Pliny there, and then I'll pass it off to somebody.
Okay. In my practice, my Lord, to refer, it is my practice, my Lord, to refer to you all matters concerning which I am in doubt. For who can better give guidance to my hesitation or inform my ignorance? I have never participated in trials of Christians, therefore I do not know what offense it is to practice, to punish, or investigate, and to what extent. I have been not a little hesitant as to whether there should be any distinction of age, or no difference between the very young and the more mature, whether pardon is to be granted for repentance, or if a man has once been a Christian, it does him no good to have ceased to be one, whether the name itself, even without offenses, or only the offenses associated with the name are to be punished.
All right, thank you very much. Somebody want to take the next paragraph? Bueller. I'll do it. Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second time and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. For I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexibility, obstinacy, surely deserved to be punished. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, pretty interesting, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. Interesting. Soon, accusations spread, as usually happens because of the proceedings going on. Those who denied, I skipped down a little bit, those who denied that they were or had been Christians, when they invoked the gods in words dictated to me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose together with the statues of the gods, and moreover cursed Christ. That's the important point there. None of which those who are really Christians, it is said, can be forced to do. Okay. And then look at the last line there in that paragraph. They all worshiped your image and the statues of God and cursed Christ. Okay. That's the important point there, because they are talking about the persecution. Isaac, sit up. They are talking about the persecution of Christians, and that's important. Sometimes you'll hear Pastor Petersen or Pastor Frese or other pastors, they'll talk about how back in these times that they used to offer incense to Caesar. And this is precisely what they're referring to. It's Pliny the Younger here. The important point is that he mentions Christ. Okay, that's what we want him to do. To demonstrate that Christ was an historical figure. They denounced, they cursed Christ. That's the important thing. As if he was an historical figure. Interesting there also, as with, let me remind you, with Josephus, he mentioned, if you look back up at Josephus, he mentions James That is perfectly legit. There's nothing wrong with that passage at all that can be proven. But he mentions James being persecuted as a believer, who was Jesus' brother, and we know for a fact that James denied Christ until he rose from the dead, and again made the illustration of, Alex over here claiming to be Jesus, and Nadia being quite skeptical of that fact. But then Alex dies. 3 days later, rises from the dead. Now Nadia may not be so skeptical.
He is a very sneaky Jesus.
Very strange one too.
All right. So, but Pliny mentions this whole notion of being Roman citizen. The book of Acts attests to this as well. Paul used that, pulled his Roman citizen card out a number of times. Okay, that's pretty interesting. So we've got kind of that reference already going on here. Mentions of Christ. Since we're running a little short on time, I'll let you guys. Let's see. What do you got? What?
Just read this next paragraph.
They asserted,
This is
however.
one of the best ones.
Oh yeah. Oh, you're right. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsibly a hymn to Christ as to a God. There you go, another mention of Christ. And to bind themselves by oath and to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, nor falsify their trust. Interesting. Sounds like the Ten Commandments. Yeah. Nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. For this they affirmed they had ceased to do after my edict, by which, in accordance with your instructions, I had forbidden political associations. Accordingly, I judged all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves, who were called deaconesses. But I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition.
I just like the description of their church service.
Yeah, no, that
On
is
fixed
good.
day, before dawn, sing
Yeah.
responsive hymns, and then bind themselves to these oaths not to do
Right.
evil.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
What horrible crimes they commit.
Right. Well, I can't remember. It might be Pliny. Do you remember who it was? I don't think I have this in there, but there was one who complained. Might still be Pliny. And I just don't have the paragraph in it. He complained, or maybe I do, and we just didn't read it. Complained about how Christians committed incest because their brothers and sisters were loving each other.
Yeah. Well, so they had one of the names that was used, and I don't know if the Christians made it up or not.
Right.
It's hard to tell who they were. But they call one of their names for communion was Latin for love feast. Right. So they get together, a bunch of brothers and sisters, before dawn, and have this love feast where they'd eat this human body.
Right.
You know, this body and blood. And they're always like, what kind of weird, crazy people are these? And then at the time, there's also a bunch of political people who were trying to like undermine the government, who were doing things like getting together before dawn and meeting in groups, and and so that's the edict he talks about. Is he banned everybody from meeting before dawn?
Right.
This is political insurrection.
Right. Those hours. Yep.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of my more liberal leaning type of Christian friends get the idea that Christianity is the original protest movement, which is complete nonsense. But they believe that. So it was weird. Yeah. So exactly what Mr. Pullman was saying. I mean, if you didn't know anything about the sacrament or about how we talked about each other as Christians, it would be weird for everybody to get together, brothers and sisters, on a Sunday morning for a love feast where we ate flesh and drank blood. That would sound really. I mean, just think about that outside of the context. Okay, be very strange. Okay, and it was strange to the Romans. Okay,
All right.
that I'm not gonna go through the response. Where's this one? There's one I definitely want to get to. That's almost a direct rep. Okay, skip down to Suetonius real quick, just so I can make sure to get this in. How do you spell Suetonius? 12 Caesars.
date? Oh.
110. Okay, so if you look there, just this one little line's particularly interesting. It's from the 12 Caesars, and this is a huge work of Roman history. But anyway, on the part of the life of Claudius. And the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Christus. He, Claudius, expelled them, the Jews, from Rome. Okay? Now look at Acts 18:12. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had committed all the Jews to leave Rome. Pretty interesting. So, a lot of people like to say that Acts is not very historically accurate. It's nonsense. Seems pretty historically accurate there. At least somebody who's trying to be historically accurate. Okay. There's the mention of Christ there. There's the parallel to Acts. It's a pretty compelling passage. I'm going to leave. There's tons more there. Take those home if you want, if you're interested in that sort of thing. You can have those. And I think you guys can see why. Again, even any scholar worth his salt is going to agree that Jesus was crucified by the Romans. Okay, that's an historical fact. And when we say Jesus, we're not talking about anybody other than the Jesus that we have in Holy Scripture. That's the one that scholars are talking about. The same Jesus us Christians are talking about. So there's just tons of evidence that's virtually irrefutable. Okay, good enough. See you next week. Don't forget, cleanup day next Saturday, party, all that stuff.